They said they were beasts of burden, creatures without souls, designed by God for the sole purpose of laboring under the lash until they died. They said that an army of slaves could never defeat the disciplined legions of Europe. They said that the idea of a Black Republic was a fever dream, an impossibility in a world ruled by white empires. But on an island in the Caribbean, in the shadow of the sugarcane fields that had consumed the lives of their ancestors, one man was quietly reading, thinking, and planning. He was a coachman, an old man by the standards of his time, a ghost in the machine of the French Empire. But inside this quiet servant lived the mind of a military genius who would soon make Napoleon Bonaparte tremble. They called him the Black Napoleon. History calls him the father of Haiti. This is the story of Toussaint Louverture and the only successful slave revolt in the history of the human race. To understand the fire that would consume the world, you must first understand the fuel. And the fuel was Saint-Domingue. In the late 18th century, this French colony, the western third of the island of Hispaniola, was the envy of the world. They called it the Pearl of the Antilles. It was the single most profitable colony on the face of the earth, the Saudi Arabia of its day. It produced 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee consumed in Europe. The wealth that flowed from its ports built the grand boulevards of Paris and Bordeaux. It was a paradise of lush mountains, turquoise waters, and unimaginable riches. But this paradise was built directly on top of a man-made hell. The wealth of Saint-Domingue was extracted through a system of slavery so brutal, so industrial in its cruelty, that it shocked even the other slaveholding societies of the Americas. The French planners had done a cold, demonic calculation. It was cheaper to work a slave to death in 3 to 7 years and buy a new one from Africa than it was to treat them well enough to survive and reproduce. The colony was a meat grinder. Over the course of a century, France imported nearly 1 million enslaved Africans to the island, and yet, due to the horrific death rate, the population never rose above 500,000. The fields of sugarcane were fertilized with the blood and bodies of men and women who were worked until their hearts simply stopped beating. The Society of Saint-Domingue was a powder keg waiting for a spark. At the top were the Grands Blancs, the wealthy white planters who lived like kings, indulging in a decadent lifestyle of operas, balls, and excess. Below them were the Petits Blancs, the poor whites, overseers, shopkeepers, laborers, who resented the rich planters but hated the enslaved population with a virulent, racist passion. In the middle was a unique and growing class of gens de couleur libre, free people of color, often the mixed-race children of masters and slaves. Many were educated, wealthy, and even owned slaves themselves, yet they were subjected to a rigid apartheid system that denied them social equality and political rights. And at the bottom, crushing everyone else with their sheer numbers, were the 500,000 enslaved Africans. They outnumbered the whites by more than 10 to 1. The atmosphere on the island was one of constant, low-level terror. The white population lived in a state of perpetual paranoia. They knew the math. They knew that if the beasts they whipped in the fields ever realized their own strength, the white colony would be wiped off the map. To maintain control, they employed a system of terror that defies description. Slaves were burned alive, broken on the wheel, buried up to their necks in the ground to be eaten by insects, or blown apart by gunpowder. This was not just punishment. It was psychological warfare designed to crush the human spirit, to make the enslaved believe that resistance was not just futile, but suicidal. But the human spirit is a stubborn thing, and amidst this landscape of death, there were men who watched and waited. One of them was a man named Toussaint. In 1789, Toussaint was roughly 46 years old. In the brutal actuarial tables of Saint-Domingue, he was an ancient survivor. He had been born into slavery on the Breda plantation, but he had been fortunate. He had been a house servant, then a coachman, roles that spared him the lethal back-breaking labor of the cane fields. He was small, physically unimposing, and possessed a quiet, reserved demeanor. To the white masters who saw him driving the carriage, he was Old Toussaint, a loyal, safe, and perhaps slightly simple servant. They had no idea who they were looking at. Toussaint was a man of secrets. He was literate, a rarity for a slave. He devoured books. He read the military histories of Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. But the book that set his soul on fire was a banned philosophical text by the French writer Abbé Raynal. In it, Raynal condemned the evils of slavery and predicted the coming of a black Spartacus, a warrior who would rise up to avenge his people and break the chains of the New World. As Toussaint read those words by candlelight, he must have felt the weight of destiny settling onto his shoulders. He was disciplined, ascetic, and possessed of a mind that could play three-dimensional chess while his opponents were playing checkers. He had used his position as a coachman to travel between plantations, building a network of contacts, listening to the whispers of rebellion, and assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the white regime. He was a spider sitting patiently at the center of a web, waiting for the wind to shake it. That wind came from across the ocean in 1789. The French Revolution erupted in Paris. The Bastille fell. The king was humbled. And a new, dangerous creed began to echo across the Atlantic. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, fraternity. The news hit Saint-Domingue like a hurricane. But each group on the island heard a different message. The rich white planters heard liberty and thought it meant liberty from the king's taxes and trade regulations. They wanted to rule the island themselves. The poor whites heard equality and thought it meant they should be equal to the rich planters. The free people of color heard fraternity and demanded their full rights as citizens of France. The island descended into chaos as these three groups began to fight amongst themselves, the white colonists even threatening to secede from France. But none of them, not the planters, not the poor whites, not the free coloreds, thought for a second that the Declaration of the Rights of Man applied to the 500,000 black slaves watching from the fields. To them, the slaves were property, not men. They were blind to the irony of fighting for freedom while holding a whip. They were so consumed by their own internal squabbles that they didn't notice the storm gathering in the slave quarters. The slaves, however, had heard the news too. They heard that the white men in France had killed their masters. They heard that a new law had declared all men free. The rumors, distorted but powerful, flew from plantation to plantation. The drivers, the slave foremen who managed the work gangs, began to hold secret meetings deep in the woods at night. They were not talking about reform. They were not talking about better rations. They were talking about the end of the world. The voodoo drums began to beat in the mountains. The spirits of war, the Loa, were being summoned. Toussaint, the quiet coachman, watched the chaos unfold among the whites with a cold, calculating eye. He saw the cracks in the system widening. He saw the masters fighting each other, leaving their guard down. He knew that the prophecy of Raynal was about to be fulfilled. The time for waiting was over. The black Spartacus was ready to rise, and he would bring a fire that would burn the pearl of the Antilles down to the bedrock. The greatest revolution the hemisphere had ever seen was about to begin. It began with a storm. On the night of August 14th, 1791, the sky over the northern province of Saint-Domingue turned in bruised purple, heavy with rain and electricity. Deep in the alligator woods of Bois Caïman, far from the prying eyes of the overseers, thousands of the enslaved gathered. They were delegates, drivers, and leaders from 100 different plantations, men and women who had slipped away in the darkness to answer a summons that pulsed like a heartbeat through the island. They gathered around a fire that hissed in the rain, waiting for a voice that would give shape to their rage. That voice belonged to Duddy Boukman, a massive man, a voodoo houngan, or high priest, who commanded a spiritual authority that the white masters could neither see nor understand. In the flickering light, amidst the chanting and the beating of drums that echoed the pounding of their own hearts, Boukman performed a ceremony that would become the genesis of a nation. A black pig was sacrificed, its blood a pact between the living and the spirits of Africa. And then, Boukman spoke the words that would burn down the French Empire. "The God of the white man calls him to commit crimes," he thundered, his voice cutting through the wind. "Our God asks only good works, but this God, who is so good, orders revenge. He will direct our hands. He will aid us. Throw away the image of the God of the whites, who thirsts for our tears, and listen to the voice of liberty, which speaks in the hearts of all of us." It was a declaration of spiritual independence. Before they could break the chains on their wrists, they had to break the chains on their minds. They had to reject the religion that told them their suffering was divinely ordained. That night, under the lightning and the rain, a pact was sealed. They would be free, or they would die. They set the date, August 22nd. When the night of August 22nd arrived, the white planters of the northern plain were sleeping in their four-poster beds, secure in the belief that their property was resting quietly in the slave quarters. They woke up to the end of the world. The signal was given, and simultaneously, across hundreds of plantations, the cane fields were set alight. Sugarcane burns with a ferocious, crackling heat, and within hours, the entire northern horizon was a wall of fire. The smoke blotted out the stars. The smell of burning sugar, usually the scent of money, became the scent of the apocalypse. The violence that followed was the unleashing of a century of suppressed agony. The enslaved rose up with machetes, with cane knives, with torches, and with their bare hands. They stormed the great houses, smashing the symbols of the wealth that had been stolen from their labor. The masters, their wives, and their children were dragged from their beds. There was no mercy, because they had been taught none. The atrocities were horrific on both sides, a bloody reckoning where the oppressed visited the sins of the fathers upon the sons. The Pearl of the Antilles was being washed in blood. But amidst this chaos, amidst the fires that consumed the plain and the mobs that roamed the countryside, Toussaint remained a ghost. He did not join the initial wave of destruction. He was waiting, watching, calculating. He was a man of discipline, not a man of mob violence. In fact, his first act of the revolution was one of extraordinary, almost baffling humanity. As the rebels closed in on the Breda plantation, Toussaint did not kill his former master, Bayon de Liberté. Instead, he saved him. He quietly gathered the white family, put them in a carriage, and sent them to safety in the port city of Le Cap, risking his own standing with the rebels to save the life of the man who had legally owned him. Why? Was it sentimentality? Perhaps. But Toussaint was playing a longer game. He knew that a mob could burn a plantation, but a mob could not build a nation. He knew that if this uprising was to be anything more than a spasm of violence that would be crushed by the French army, it needed legitimacy. It needed leaders who were not just butchers. By saving his master, he proved that he was a man of honor, a man who could be negotiated with, a man who was morally superior to the system he was fighting. He was keeping his hands clean for the diplomacy he knew would come. Only after his master was safe did Toussaint ride into the rebel camps. What he found there would have discouraged a lesser man. The rebel army was a chaotic, disorganized mass of thousands of men and women. They were drunk on rum and freedom, armed with stolen tools and rusty muskets they didn't know how to use. They were brave, yes, but they were undisciplined. They had no strategy, no supply lines, no vision beyond the next plantation they could burn. They were led by charismatic but erratic chieftains like Biassou and Jean-François, men who adorned themselves in stolen silks and epaulets, but had no concept of military tactics. Toussaint looked at this swirling chaos and saw the raw material of destiny. He knew that the French would regroup. He knew that professional soldiers were coming from Europe. He knew that courage alone against cannons was a suicide pact. If these men were going to survive, they had to stop being a mob and start being an army. He entered the camp not as a general, but as a doctor. He used his knowledge of herbs and medicine to tend to the wounded, earning the trust and gratitude of the rank and file. He was the old man, the wise figure in the corner. But slowly, quietly, he began to assert his authority. He began to advise the leaders. He began to organize small groups of men, teaching them discipline, teaching them silence. He saw that the rebels' greatest strength was the land itself. The French fought in formation, in lines, in the open. Toussaint taught his men the way of the forest. He taught them to strike and fade away, to use the jungle as a weapon, to lure the French into ambushes. He began to train an elite guard, men who were loyal only to him, men who moved with the precision of a machine. It was during this time that he stopped being Toussaint of Breda. He chose a new name, a name that was a promise and a prophecy. He called himself Toussaint Louverture. Louverture means the opening. Some say it was because he had lost his front teeth. Others say it was because he could open a hole in any enemy line. But the truth was deeper. He was the opening to liberty. He was the door through which his people would walk from the darkness of slavery into the light of freedom. By 1893, the initial fires had burned down to embers, and the hard reality of war had set in. The French commissioners, desperate to restore order, were fighting back with brutal efficiency. The rebel leaders were squabbling. The revolution was on the brink of collapse. Toussaint knew that to win, he needed more than just guerrilla tactics. He needed a powerful ally. He looked at the chessboard of the Caribbean and saw an opportunity that no one else saw. Spain, which owned the eastern two-thirds of the island, modern-day Dominican Republic, was at war with revolutionary France. The King of Spain wanted to see the French colony destroyed. Toussaint made a cold, calculated decision. He crossed the border and offered his services, and his growing army of disciplined soldiers, to the King of Spain. He would fight for a white king to kill white Republicans, as long as that king gave him guns, ammunition, and the title of general. It was a masterstroke. The Spaniards, desperate for manpower, accepted. They gave Toussaint everything he needed. They gave him the uniform of a Spanish general. They gave him supplies, and most importantly, they gave him the legitimacy of a state power. Toussaint Louverture was no longer a rebel slave leader running in the woods. He was a general in the Royal Army of Spain, and he was about to turn his guns on the French with a ferocity and a skill that would stun the world. The coachman had become a commander. The chess game had truly begun. The sight of Toussaint Louverture in the uniform of a Spanish general was a nightmare that the French colonial masters could never have imagined in their darkest fever dreams. Here was the man who had driven their carriages, the old Negro they had dismissed as a harmless fixture of the plantation, now riding at the head of an army of 4,000 disciplined soldiers, flying the flag of the King of Spain. He wore a general's hat with a red feather, a sword at his side, and he carried himself with an aristocratic bearing that commanded instant, terrifying respect. But it was not the uniform that frightened the French. It was the mind beneath the hat. Toussaint did not fight like a slave rebel. He fought like a European monarch. He used his time with the Spanish, not just to acquire guns and powder, but to acquire the art of war. He observed the Spanish officers, absorbed their manuals on drill and maneuver, and then adapted them to the unique terrain of Saint-Domingue. He realized that the rigid, linear formations of European warfare were suicide in the dense, mountainous jungles of the island. so he created a hybrid style of warfare that the world had never seen before. He taught his men to fight in the European style, when necessary, standing in lines, firing volleys, fixing bayonets, but he also taught them to dissolve instantly into the forest, to become invisible, to strike from the shadows and vanish before the enemy could return fire. He drilled them relentlessly. He forbade the looting and drunkenness that plagued other rebel bands. He instilled in them a sense of pride and professionalism. They were not runaways. They were soldiers of the king, fighting for their own land. Under Toussaint's command, a new breed of leader began to emerge from the ranks, men who would become legends in their own right. There was Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a former field slave whose back was a roadmap of whip scars. Dessalines was Toussaint's iron fist, a man of ferocious, almost psychopathic violence, who hated white people with a purity that burned like acid. Where Toussaint was the diplomat and the strategist, Dessalines was the tiger, the avenging angel. Then there was Henri Christophe, a former waiter and mason, proud, haughty, and brilliant, who understood administration and order. Toussaint harnessed these volatile personalities, binding them to his will, creating a high command that rivaled any in Europe. With this army, Toussaint swept through the northern province like a scythe. He captured town after town for Spain: Gonaives, Gros Morne, Dondon, Marmalade. The French Republican troops, demoralized and outnumbered, crumbled before him. Toussaint was expanding the Spanish Empire's territory by the day, and the Spanish governors in Saint-Domingue were delighted. They thought they were using this clever black man to destroy their French rivals. They didn't realize that Toussaint was using them. He was using Spain to build an army that would eventually answer to no king but him. He was using their resources to forge a weapon that could secure true freedom for his people. Because Toussaint knew a secret that the Spanish ignored. Kings don't care about slaves. The King of Spain was a slave owner himself. He was happy to use Toussaint's black soldiers to kill French Republicans, but he had no intention of ending slavery on the island. Toussaint knew this alliance was temporary. He was playing a dangerous game of geopolitical poker, waiting for a better card to be dealt. And then the board got even more complicated. In 1793, the British Empire decided to make its move. Britain was at war with revolutionary France, and they saw the chaos in Saint-Domingue as a golden opportunity to seize the richest colony in the world. But the British had another, darker motivation. They owned Jamaica, just across the water, a colony filled with slaves. They were terrified that the contagion of freedom would spread from Saint-Domingue to their own islands. They wanted to invade Saint-Domingue not just to steal it, but to crush the slave revolt and re-establish the old order of chains and whips. A massive British expeditionary force landed in the south and west of the island. The white French planters, the Grand Blancs, who had been terrified of the revolution, welcomed the British with open arms. They preferred to be British subjects with slaves than French citizens without them. They surrendered key ports like Port-au-Prince and Jérémie to the British without firing a shot. Now, the island was a three-way slaughterhouse. In the north, Toussaint and his black army were fighting for Spain against the French. In the south and west, the British and the white planters were fighting against the French. And in the middle, squeezed from all sides, were the French Republican commissioners, led by a radical Jacobin named Léger Félicité Sonthonax. Sonthonax was in an impossible position. He was a representative of the French Revolution, sent to save the colony for France. But he was surrounded. The Spanish were attacking from the east, the British from the west, and the white planters had betrayed him. He had only a few thousand French troops who were dying of yellow fever by the day. He looked at the map and realized he had lost. France had lost. There was no way to hold the colony against the combined might of Spain, Britain, and the white traders. Unless he did the one thing that was forbidden. Unless he unleashed the only force on the island powerful enough to stop the empires. On August 29, 1793, in a desperate, radical gamble to save the colony, Sonthonax issued a proclamation that changed history. He declared that slavery was abolished, not just for the rebel warriors, but for everyone. Every black man, woman, and child in Saint-Domingue was now free, and they were all citizens of the French Republic. It was a thunderclap. It was the first time a major European power had abolished slavery in its colonies. But Sonthonax didn't do it out of pure altruism. He did it because he needed an army. He was betting that if he gave the slaves their freedom, they would fight for France to keep it. News of the proclamation raced through the mountains to Toussaint's camp. He held the paper in his hands, reading the words that he had dreamed of his entire life. Liberté, égalité. France had done what Spain would never do. France had officially killed slavery. This was the moment of truth. Toussaint was standing at the crossroads of destiny. On one side was Spain. They gave him guns, status, and safety, but they represented the old world of kings and slaves. On the other side was France. They were weak, desperate, and surrounded, but they offered the one thing that mattered: universal liberty. Toussaint looked at his army. He looked at the Spanish officers who sneered at him behind his back. He looked at the British who were landing on the coast with chains in their cargo holds. And he looked at the tricolor flag of the French Republic, now the only flag in the world that stood for the freedom of his people. He knew that Sonthonax's decree was just a piece of paper unless it was defended with steel. He knew that if the British or the Spanish won, slavery would return, and the proclamation would be burned along with the people it freed. The only way to secure this freedom was to fight for the side that had granted it. But switching sides was a move of extreme peril. His family was essentially being held hostage behind Spanish lines. His ammunition came from Spanish stores. To turn on them was to risk everything. He had to be sure. He waited, watching to see if the government in Paris would ratify Sonthonax's decree. When the news came that the National Convention in Paris had indeed voted to abolish slavery in all French colonies, Toussaint made his choice. The Black Spartacus was about to change the game again. He was done with Spain. He was done fighting for kings. He gathered his officers, Dessalines, Christophe, and the others, and told them the plan. They were going to turn their guns around. They were going to slaughter their Spanish allies, join the desperate French Republicans, and drive the British into the sea. The chess master had seen the winning move, and the board was about to be soaked in blood. The great turn was beginning. On May 6, 1794, the sun rose over the Spanish garrison at Gonaives, bathing the town in a deceptively peaceful light. The Spanish officers, comfortable in their alliance with the brilliant black general, went about their morning routines. They attended mass, they inspected their troops, they looked out over the territory they believed they controlled. They had no idea that the man they called General Toussaint had already signed their death warrants. The betrayal was executed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. At a prearranged signal, Toussaint's troops, who were garrisoned inside the town alongside their Spanish allies, turned their muskets around. In a matter of minutes, the Spanish authority in the region was liquidated. It was a masterclass in deception. Toussaint had used Spanish gold to arm his men, Spanish food to feed them, and Spanish gunpowder to train them. And now he used those very resources to slaughter them. He tore down the red and gold flag of the Spanish Bourbons, a symbol of the old world of slavery, and raised the French tricolor, blue, white, and red. But this was not just a change of flags. It was a seismic shift in the moral universe of the Caribbean. Toussaint issued a proclamation to the people of Saint-Domingue, a document that rang out like a bell in the night. It was the first time the world truly heard his voice, and it was the voice of a man who knew exactly who he was. "Brothers and friends," he wrote, "I am Toussaint Louverture. Perhaps my name has made itself known to you. I have undertaken vengeance. I want liberty and equality to reign in Saint-Domingue. I work to bring them into existence. Unite yourselves to us, brothers, and fight with us for the same cause." With those words, the old Toussaint was dead. The hesitancy was gone. He was now the avatar of the revolution. He launched a blitzkrieg campaign that would have made Napoleon proud. His army, now fighting as soldiers of the French Republic, swept through the Artibonite Valley like a hurricane. They captured the towns of Ennery, Dondon, and Terre-Neuve in rapid succession. The Spanish forces, stunned by the betrayal and terrified of the ferocity of Toussaint's men, crumbled. But the French Republic was still on the brink of annihilation. The French Governor-General, Etienne Lavaux, was trapped in the coastal town of Port-de-Paix. He was surrounded on land by British forces and hostile rebel bands, and blockaded by the British Navy at sea. His troops were starving, dying of disease, and reduced to eating their own pack mules. Lavaux was writing his last letters, preparing to die, believing that the colony was lost, and that slavery would be restored by the British conquerors. And then, over the ridge, came Toussaint. He marched his army over mountains that white officers deemed impassable. He smashed through the besieging lines, routing the enemies that had trapped Lavaux. When Toussaint rode into Port-de-Paix, he did not come as a subordinate. He came as a savior. The meeting between the two men was a tableau of the new reality. Lavaux, an aristocrat by birth but a Republican by conviction, embraced the former slave with tears in his eyes. He called Toussaint his savior and his son. In a moment of profound symbolic power, Lavaux appointed Toussaint Louverture as his chief lieutenant. It was an acknowledgement that the power dynamic had shifted forever. The white governor was nominally in charge, but the black general held the sword. Lavaux, seeing the tactical genius and the charisma of the man before him, famously declared, "This represents the Black Spartacus, predicted by Raynal, whose destiny it is to avenge the wrongs committed against his race." The prophecy had been fulfilled in the flesh. With his flank secured and the Spanish threat largely neutralized, Toussaint turned his gaze toward the true enemy, the British Empire. The British were a different beast than the Spanish. They were the world's superpower. Their army was disciplined, well-equipped, and backed by the most powerful navy in history. They held the key port of Port-au-Prince and the rich western province. They had reinstated slavery in the areas they occupied, and the French planters were living high on the hog again, protected by British bayonets. Toussaint began a war of attrition against the British that would break their spirit. He knew he could not defeat the British Navy at sea, and he knew that facing their heavy infantry in open field battles was risky. So he dragged them into the terrain. He forced them to fight in the steep ravines and the malaria-choked swamps. He utilized a tactic known as terre brûlée, scorched earth. When he was forced to retreat, he burned everything: fields, mills, houses. He left the British nothing but ash and hunger. His men were ghosts. They would strike a British column, kill the officers, and vanish into the foliage before the redcoats could form a firing line. The British soldiers, encased in heavy wool uniforms under the tropical sun, dropped like flies from yellow fever and heat stroke. Toussaint weaponized the climate. He famously said of the British generals, "They have cannons, but I have the rain and the sun." But Toussaint was fighting another war simultaneously, a political war within his own camp. The French colony was not unified. While Toussaint controlled the black masses in the north, the south of the island was controlled by the gens de couleur libre, the free mixed-race population. They were led by a capable, proud, and ruthless general named André Rigaud. Rigaud and his caste had welcomed the end of slavery with extreme reluctance. They viewed themselves as culturally French, superior to the black African masses who worked the fields. They saw Toussaint not as a liberator, but as an upstart, a threat to their own social standing. They were Republicans, yes, but they were elitists. Toussaint saw them as a dangerous fifth column, men who would potentially side with the planters to keep the black population in check. The tension between Toussaint in the north and Rigaud in the south was palpable. It was a clash of color, class, and culture. Toussaint knew that eventually he would have to deal with Rigaud. But for now, they had a common enemy in the British. By 1795, Toussaint had effectively performed a miracle. He had taken a ragtag band of rebels and forged them into the most effective fighting force in the Western Hemisphere. He had played the great empires of Europe against one another, using Spain to get guns, then using those guns to save France. He had secured the abolition of slavery, not just in law, but in fact, on the ground, with steel. He began to act not just as a general, but as a governor. In the territories he controlled, he demanded discipline. He ordered the former slaves to return to the plantations, not as slaves, but as paid laborers. This was his most controversial policy. He believed that the only way to keep freedom was to prove that a black colony could be economically viable. The sugar had to flow, or France would abandon them. He enforced a system of militarized agriculture, driven by the belief that the survival of the revolution depended on the economy. He was building a state within a state. He communicated directly with the government in Paris, bypassing Laveau when it suited him. He was accumulating power with a terrifying singleness of purpose. The white planters who remained began to realize that their savior was actually their new master. They were no longer in charge. Toussaint was. As 1796 dawned, the British were bleeding out. Their invasion, which was supposed to be a cakewalk, had turned into a graveyard. They had lost thousands of men to Toussaint's ambushes and the black vomit of yellow fever. They were holding on to the coastal cities by their fingernails. Toussaint was tightening the noose. He was preparing for the final push that would drive the British into the sea. But his ambition was growing. He didn't just want to be a general in the French army. He wanted to be the undisputed leader of Saint-Domingue. And to do that, he would eventually have to remove the very man he had saved, Governor Laveau. Toussaint was playing a game of 4D chess, and he was already thinking 5 moves ahead. The British were the immediate threat, but the true struggle for the soul of the island, and for absolute power, was just beginning. The Black Napoleon was rising, and his shadow was beginning to cover the entire island. The age of the warlords was over. The age of the statesman had arrived. By 1797, the British Empire was learning a lesson written in blood and bile. Saint-Domingue was not a prize to be won. It was a graveyard to be feared. The British High Command in London had looked at the map of the Caribbean and seen gold. They saw a colony in chaos, ripe for the picking. They believed that their disciplined redcoats, the finest infantry in the world, would march into Port-au-Prince, crush the unruly mobs of former slaves, and restore the profitable order of the plantation system. They had allocated millions of pounds and sent tens of thousands of men to secure this jewel. But what they found was a green hell that swallowed armies whole. The war against the British was Toussaint Louverture's masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. He knew he could not defeat the British in a standing battle on a flat plain. The British square was unbreakable. Their volley fire was devastating. So Toussaint refused to give them the war they wanted. He gave them the war they couldn't understand. He drew them deep into the interior, stretching their supply lines until they snapped. He attacked their convoys at night, his men moving like phantoms through the dense foliage, striking with machetes and vanishing before the British could load their muskets. But Toussaint had an ally more lethal than any musket: the Yellow Jack. Yellow fever. The British soldiers, encased in thick wool uniforms designed for the cool mists of Europe, marched into the tropical heat and began to die in droves. The mosquito, the vector of the disease, was the unacknowledged general of Toussaint's army. Entire regiments would arrive from Portsmouth, fresh-faced and eager, and within 3 months, 80% of them would be dead. Their skin turned a jaundiced yellow, vomiting black bile as their organs shut down. It was a biological war of attrition. Toussaint knew that he didn't have to kill every British soldier. He just had to keep the war going long enough for the fever to do the work for him. "The terrain is our fortress," he told his officers. "The fever is our artillery." The cost to Britain was staggering. In their 5-year attempt to conquer Saint-Domingue, they lost over 50,000 men and spent millions of pounds sterling. It was a Vietnam War for the 18th century, a quagmire that was draining the treasury and the blood of the empire. The British Parliament began to ask hard questions. Why were they pouring gold and lives into a hole in the Caribbean? Enter General Thomas Maitland. Maitland was a pragmatic, hard-nosed British officer sent to salvage the situation. He arrived expecting to fight a savage. He found a statesman. Maitland realized quickly that the war was unwinnable. He saw the discipline of Toussaint's troops, the loyalty of the population, and the sheer impossibility of re-enslaving a people who had tasted freedom. He realized that Britain's best option was not conquest, but containment. He needed to extricate his army with some shred of dignity intact. So, the representative of the King of England sat down across the table from the former coachman of Breda. The negotiations between Maitland and Toussaint were a pivotal moment in history. It was the first time a European superpower treated a black revolutionary leader as a head of state. Maitland tried to flatter Toussaint. He offered to make him a king, recognized by Britain, if only he would declare independence from France and grant Britain exclusive trading rights. It was a tempting offer. Toussaint could have had a crown, but Toussaint was too smart for that. He knew that a crown given by the British came with British strings. He knew they would eventually try to restore slavery. So he outmaneuvered Maitland. He negotiated a secret treaty. The British would leave the island, evacuate all their forts, and lift the naval blockade. In exchange, Toussaint promised not to export his revolution to British Jamaica. He promised not to send his Black Spartacus army to liberate the slaves on the neighboring islands. It was a cold, calculated act of realpolitik. Toussaint prioritized the survival of freedom in Saint-Domingue over the spread of freedom elsewhere. He secured a trade deal with Britain and even with the United States, whose president, John Adams, was surprisingly open to trading with the black rebels to spite the French. On August 31st, 1798, the British army marched out of Port-au-Prince. It was a moment of incredible symbolism. The Union Jack, the flag that flew over an empire on which the sun never set, was lowered. The army that had conquered India and North America retreated in defeat before an army of former slaves. Toussaint rode into the city in triumph. He was now the master of the North and the West. He had defeated Spain. He had defeated Britain. He was the savior of the French Republic. But as the British ships faded over the horizon, the unity of the island began to fracture. With the external enemies gone, the internal contradictions of the revolution boiled to the surface. Toussaint looked south, and he saw his next problem. General André Rigaud. Rigaud controlled the southern peninsula of the island. He was the leader of the gens de couleur libre, the free mixed-race elite. His army was disciplined, well-equipped, and fiercely loyal. But Rigaud and his followers had a different vision for the island. They were fighting for equality with whites, but they still looked down on the black masses, the former field hands who made up Toussaint's base. They were culturally French, proud of their education, their skin tone, and their property. They viewed Toussaint as a usurper, an uneducated African who had risen above his station. The tension between the two men was personal and political. It was a clash of caste. The French government, now turning more conservative in Paris, saw an opportunity. They sent a new agent, Edouville, to the island with secret instructions to sow discord between Toussaint and Rigaud. Divide and rule was the oldest trick in the colonial playbook. Edouville whispered in Rigaud's ear that Toussaint was planning to kill all the mulattoes. He whispered in Toussaint's ear that Rigaud was planning to re-enslave the blacks. Toussaint saw the trap, but he couldn't avoid the conflict. He knew that Saint-Domingue could not survive with two heads. It needed one leader, one vision. He tried diplomacy, but the poison had spread too deep. In June 1799, the inevitable exploded. It was called the War of Knives. It was a civil war of horrific brutality. It wasn't fought with the strategic maneuvering of the war against the British. It was fought with a visceral, intimate hatred. Rigaud's forces, elite and proud, fought with the desperation of a class that sees its privilege evaporating. Toussaint's forces, vastly superior in numbers, fought with the rage of the formerly enslaved against those who had once been their overseers. Toussaint unleashed his tiger, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. He gave Dessalines command of the campaign against the South, and Dessalines marched with a terrifying ruthlessness. He famously told his troops, "The Revolutionary War is a war of extermination." He did not take prisoners. When Rigaud's territory was captured, the reprisals were severe. Thousands of mixed-race people were massacred, a bloodletting that would leave scars on the Haitian psyche for centuries. Toussaint, usually the voice of moderation, allowed Dessalines to do the dirty work. He needed the South broken. He needed absolute unity. He blockaded Rigaud's ports with the help of the American Navy. Yes, the United States Navy helped Toussaint Louverture defeat his rival, a strange historical anomaly where the U.S. supported a slave revolt leader to protect its trade interests. By August 1800, Rigaud was defeated. He fled to France, broken and bitter, waiting for a chance to return. Toussaint entered the southern capital of L'Écaille. He was now the undisputed master of the entire French colony. He had eliminated every rival. He had defeated every foreign invader. He stood at the pinnacle of his power. But Toussaint knew that power was fragile. He looked across the border to the eastern side of the island, to Spanish Saint-Domingue. Spain had technically ceded the territory to France years earlier in a treaty, but the French had never occupied it. It was still run by a Spanish governor, and crucially, slavery still existed there. Toussaint saw a threat. He saw a back door through which the French could land an army to attack him, and he saw his brothers and sisters in chains just across a river. In January 1801, defying direct orders from Napoleon Bonaparte in France, Toussaint invaded Saint-Domingue. It was a lightning campaign. The Spanish governor, lacking troops and will, surrendered almost immediately. Toussaint rode into the capital city of Saint-Domingue and stood in the cathedral. In a single decree, he abolished slavery on the eastern half of the island. For the first time in history, the entire island of Hispaniola was under one flag, and that flag stood for universal freedom. Toussaint Louverture ruled from coast to coast. He commanded an army of 50,000 veterans. He controlled a flourishing economy. He was, for all intents and purposes, a king without a crown. But back in France, the wind was changing. The chaos of the French Revolution had ended. A new order had risen from the ashes of the guillotine. A short, ambitious Corsican general had seized power in a coup. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and Napoleon did not like the idea of a gilded African ruling his most valuable colony. He did not like the idea of former slaves wearing generals' uniforms. He needed the sugar profits to fund his wars in Europe, and he believed that sugar could only be produced by slaves. Toussaint had secured the island, but he had awakened a dragon. He sat down to write a constitution for Saint-Domingue, a document that would solidify his rule and his legacy. But when he sent a copy to Napoleon, he wasn't just sending a legal document. He was sending a challenge. He signed it, from the first of the blacks to the first of the whites. It was an act of supreme hubris, and it was the spark that would ignite the final apocalyptic phase of the war. The Black Napoleon was about to face the armies of the White Napoleon, and the Caribbean Sea was about to turn red. By 1801, Toussaint Louverture stood at the summit of a mountain of skulls, the undisputed master of Hispaniola. He was the most powerful black man in the world, a figure of international fascination and fear. He lived in a palace. He traveled in a carriage drawn by white horses, surrounded by a personal guard of elite cavalry in silver helmets. When he entered a room, white planters bowed low, and black laborers cheered. He had achieved the impossible. He had carved a state out of a slave colony, and he ruled it with an iron will. But heavy is the head that wears the hat of a general who acts like a king. Toussaint faced a dilemma that has haunted every revolutionary leader in history. How do you build a country out of ashes? The revolution had destroyed the economy. The plantations were burned ruins. The sugar mills were rusted skeletons. The former slaves, quite naturally, associated agricultural labor with the torture of the lash. They wanted to claim small plots of land, grow yams and vegetables, and live in peace as subsistence farmers. They wanted to be free from the cane. Toussaint, however, saw the world with the cold eyes of a statesman. He knew that freedom without an economy was a death sentence. He knew that Saint-Domingue needed to buy guns, gunpowder, and ships to defend itself against the inevitable return of the Europeans. And the only thing the world wanted from Saint-Domingue was sugar. Sugar was the currency of their survival. So, Toussaint did something that broke the hearts of the people who had fought for him. He militarized agriculture. He instituted a system called cultivation de la terre, enforced farming. He ordered the former slaves back to the plantations. They were not slaves. They were paid a share of the profits. They could not be whipped, and they were legally free citizens. But they were not free to leave. They were bound to the soil, enforced by the army. The generals became the new overseers. Dessalines, in particular, drove his workers with a ferocity that rivaled the old white masters. To the common man in the field, this looked suspiciously like the old slavery, just with a black face holding the whip. Resentment began to boil. Toussaint, the father, began to look like a tyrant. The disconnect between the leader and his people grew dangerously wide. This tension exploded in the rebellion of General Moïse. Moïse was Toussaint's adopted nephew, a brave and popular general who represented the radical heart of the revolution. Moïse hated the white planters. He hated that Toussaint allowed them to keep their land and treated them with respect. He famously said, "General Toussaint loves the whites more than he loves us." Moïse led an uprising of field workers in the north, demanding true freedom and the redistribution of land. Toussaint faced a heartbreaking choice: family or the state, revolution or order. He chose the state. He crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency. And then, in an act that stunned the island, he ordered the execution of his own nephew. Moïse stood before the firing squad, refusing to be blindfolded, and gave the order to fire himself. With that volley of musket fire, something died in the soul of the revolution. Toussaint had preserved order, but he had severed the emotional bond with the masses. He was now respected, feared, but perhaps no longer loved. He was alone at the top. In this isolation, Toussaint made his most audacious and fatal move. He decided to codify his power. In 1801, he gathered a constitutional assembly, mostly made up of rich white planters, interestingly enough, and drafted a constitution for Saint-Domingue. It was a document of staggering hubris and brilliance. Article 3 was the death knell of the old world. There cannot exist slaves on this territory. Servitude is therein forever abolished. All men are born, live, and die, free and French. It was the first constitution in history to prohibit discrimination based on skin color. But the rest of the document was a mirror of Toussaint's ambition. It appointed Toussaint Louverture as Governor General for life, with the power to choose his own successor. It did not declare independence from France. Toussaint still believed he needed the protection of the French Empire, but it established a state that was independent in everything but name. There were no French officials with power. No French laws applied unless Toussaint approved them. It was a declaration of autonomy, written in ink, signed by a former slave. When Toussaint sent the document to France, he wasn't asking for permission. He was informing the metropole of a fait accompli. He was daring Napoleon to object. And in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte objected. The timing could not have been worse for Toussaint. The wars in Europe had paused. France had signed the Treaty of Amiens with Britain. For the first time in years, the seas were open, and Napoleon's Grand Army was idle. The first consul of France turned his eyes to the Caribbean. Napoleon was surrounded by the colonial lobby, wealthy planters who had lost their fortunes in the Revolution, and his own wife Josephine, whose family owned plantations in Martinique. They whispered in his ear that Toussaint was a savage, a usurper, a monkey dressed in a general's uniform. They told him that the sugar wealth of the colony could only be restored if the blacks were put back in chains. Napoleon didn't care about race personally. He cared about power and order. But he looked at Toussaint's constitution, and he saw a challenge to his authority. "He has torn the name of France from these papers," Napoleon raged. He famously said, "I will not leave an epaulet on the shoulder of a single one of these gilded Africans." Napoleon had a grand vision. He wanted to rebuild a French empire in the Americas. He had secretly reacquired the massive Louisiana territory from Spain. He planned to use the Mississippi Valley to feed the sugar islands of the Caribbean. But the jewel of this empire, Saint-Domingue, was run by a black man who acted like a king. Toussaint had to go. Napoleon began to assemble the Leclerc expedition. It was the largest naval force ever sent by France to the Americas. 86 warships, transport vessels carrying 20,000 battle-hardened veterans of the Rhine and the Nile, elite grenadiers, heavy artillery, cavalry. He placed his own brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, in command. Leclerc's orders were secret and chilling. They were divided into 3 phases. Phase 1. Promise the black generals anything. Flatter them. Say that France accepts their freedom. Occupy the key cities peacefully. Phase 2. Disarm the black troops. Deport the black generals who resist. Phase 3. The restoration of the old order. Slavery. It was a plan of extermination and re-enslavement, masked in diplomacy. As the massive French armada gathered in the ports of Brest and Toulon, Toussaint's spies in France sent him frantic warnings. "The whites are coming," they said. "They are coming to kill us all." Toussaint stood on the cliffs of the Samana Peninsula in January 1802, looking out at the horizon. He saw the sails, dozens of them, then scores, then hundreds. The ocean was white with the canvas of the French fleet. It was a force powerful enough to conquer a continent. Toussaint turned to his officers. The man who had never shown fear, the man who had outsmarted every enemy, felt a cold chill of recognition. He knew the French army. He knew their discipline. He knew that this wasn't a raiding party. It was an extinction event. "We must perish," he reportedly said, his voice heavy with the weight of the prophecy he had tried to fulfill. "All of France has come to Saint-Domingue. They have been deceived. They come to take vengeance and enslave the blacks." But Toussaint Louverture did not become the Black Napoleon by surrendering to despair. If France wanted the island back, they would have to take it from his cold, dead hands. He mounted his horse, Bel Argent, and rode to his headquarters. He sent out the fastest riders to Dessalines, to Christophe, to Maurepas. The orders were simple, brutal, and total. They were the orders of a man who would rather burn his kingdom to ash than see it in chains again. "Do not trust the whites," the orders read. "If they try to land, burn the cities, poison the wells, destroy the roads, retreat to the mountains. Let the only thing they find be rain, rocks, and ashes. The earth must burn under their feet." The diplomatic phase was over. The era of the statesman had ended. The Black Spartacus picked up his sword again. The War of Independence had begun, and it would be fought with a ferocity that would make the previous 10 years look like a skirmish. The stage was set for the final apocalyptic clash between the greatest general of Europe and the greatest general of the Americas, and only one would survive. February 1802. The French fleet, a forest of masts and sails, filled the harbor of Le Cap, the colonial capital known as the Paris of the Antilles. On the decks of the flagship stood General Charles Leclerc, the brother-in-law of Napoleon, surrounded by a glittering staff of officers who had conquered Italy and Egypt. They looked at the city below, the stone mansions, the paved streets, the bustling port, and they saw a prize to be reclaimed. They expected a quick surrender. They expected the insolent blacks to be awed by the sheer might of the French Republic. They sent a messenger to the city's commander, General Henri Christophe, with a simple demand: surrender the city within 24 hours or face the wrath of France. Henri Christophe, a former waiter who had become a giant of a man and a general of iron discipline, received the messenger in his headquarters. He read the letter. He looked at the massive fleet that could level his city with a single broadside. And then he dictated a reply that stands as one of the most defiant statements in the history of warfare. "You will not enter the city of Le Cap," Christophe told the French envoy, "until it has been reduced to ashes. And even on these ashes, I will fight you." He ended the message with a line of terrifying poetry: "I shall write you my answer on a sheet of flames." Leclerc thought it was a bluff. It was inconceivable to the European mind that a general would destroy his own capital, his own wealth, his own home, just to make a point. But Leclerc did not understand the men he was fighting. He did not understand that for Christophe and Toussaint, the stone mansions of Le Cap were not symbols of wealth. They were monuments to the blood of their ancestors. They were willing to burn the past to save the future. When the 24 hours were up, Leclerc ordered his troops to land. As the first French boots hit the sand, Christophe gave the signal. He personally took a torch to his own palatial home. His soldiers moved from house to house, from warehouse to warehouse, spreading the fire. They ignited the vast stores of sugar, coffee, and rum. The city exploded. The Paris of the Antilles became a furnace. The heat was so intense it could be felt by the sailors on the ships in the harbor. The sky turned a choking black, lit from below by a hellish orange glow. When the French troops finally marched into the city, they found nothing but smoking ruins and charred stone. There was no food. There was no shelter. There were no slaves to welcome them. There was only the smell of ash and the eerie silence of a ghost town. Christophe and his army had vanished into the mountains, leaving the French holding a pile of rubble. The message was clear. You want the colony? Here it is. It is ash. If you want us, come and find us in the hell we have prepared for you. This was the pattern across the island. Toussaint's scorched earth order was carried out with biblical thoroughness. Maurepas burned Port-de-Paix. Dessalines burned Saint-Marc. The rich, fertile plains that Napoleon needed to fund his empire were turned into a moonscape. The French army, the finest military machine in Europe, found itself marching through a wasteland, harassed by invisible snipers, their supply lines cut, their morale sapped by the sight of total destruction. Toussaint Louverture was fighting a war of movement. He knew he could not match the French firepower in a static siege, so he drew them in. He lured Leclerc's columns deep into the jagged, mountainous interior of the island. He forced them to drag their heavy cannons up muddy ravines and through dense, steaming jungles. He struck at their flanks, killed their stragglers, and disappeared before the French could form their battle lines. But the French were not easily defeated. They were veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, tough, disciplined, and led by competent generals. They pushed relentlessly. They utilized their own brutality, executing prisoners, drowning captured rebels in the harbors, and constructing gibbets along the roads to terrify the population. The war quickly devolved into a cycle of atrocity and counter-atrocity. Dessalines, true to his nature, responded to every French execution by slaughtering French prisoners. The rivers ran red. One of the most significant battles of this phase took place at the Ravine à Couleuvre, the Snake Gully. Here, Toussaint decided to make a stand. He had to buy time for his other armies to regroup. The battle was a ferocious, close-quarters bloodbath in the steep terrain. Toussaint, usually the distant strategist, rode into the thick of the fighting, sword in hand, rallying his men. The French grenadiers, the elite shock troops of the Republic, charged up the slopes with bayonets fixed. Toussaint's men met them with a withering fire. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Though the French technically held the field at the end of the day, Toussaint had inflicted massive casualties and successfully withdrew his army intact. He had proven that his ragtag soldiers could stand toe-to-toe with the conquerors of Europe. But the French had a secret weapon, or so they thought. They had brought Toussaint's two sons, Isaac and Placide, who had been studying in France. Napoleon had sent them back as hostages, as bargaining chips. Leclerc sent the boys, along with their tutor, to Toussaint's mountain stronghold. The scene was Shakespearean. The boys, indoctrinated in French schools, begged their father to surrender, to trust in the benevolence of the first consul. They told him that Napoleon only wanted peace. Toussaint looked at his sons, whom he loved deeply. He looked at the letter from Napoleon they carried, and he made the hardest choice a father can make. He kissed his sons, told them he loved them, and then sent them back to Leclerc. He chose his people over his blood. "Tell the first consul," he said, "that I will fight until the last drop of my blood to preserve the liberty of my race." The war ground on. February turned to March. The French were winning territory, capturing towns, and pushing the rebel armies further into the Cahos Mountains. But they were paying a price they hadn't calculated. The French soldiers, sweating in their heavy wool uniforms, began to complain of headaches. Then came the fever, then the black vomit. The yellow jack had arrived. Toussaint knew the seasons. He knew that if he could hold out until the summer rains, the mosquito armies would do what his muskets could not. "We have two allies," he told his officers, "the mountains and the fever. We must survive the first to let the second do its work." The French soldiers were baffled by their enemy. They had been told they were fighting savages. But as they marched through the jungle, they heard the rebels singing. And they weren't singing tribal chants. They were singing La Marseillaise and Ça ira, the anthems of the French Revolution. They were singing about liberty, equality, and fraternity while shooting at the soldiers who flew the French flag. It was a psychological hammer blow. The French troops began to wonder, who are the real Republicans here? Us, the invaders trying to restore chains? Or them, the rebels dying for the right to be free? By late March, Toussaint's position was becoming desperate. His armies were split. Some of his generals, tired of the war and seduced by Leclerc's promises of keeping their rank and pay, began to defect. The French were closing the net. Toussaint needed to make a final, legendary stand. He needed a symbol of resistance that would show the French that the cost of victory was too high. He looked at the map and pointed to a small, rectangular fort perched on a hill in the Artibonite Valley. It was called Crête à Pierrot. It was a small fortification, seemingly insignificant. But Toussaint decided that this pile of stones would be the anvil upon which he would break the French army. He placed his most ferocious lieutenant, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, in command of the fort. He gave him a garrison of 900 men, and he gave him a simple order: hold. Hold until you die. Burn the fort around you if you have to, but do not let the white man take this hill. The Battle of Crête à Pierrot was about to begin. It would be the Thermopylae of the Haitian Revolution, a battle of such intense, concentrated violence and heroism that it would become the stuff of legend. 12,000 French soldiers were marching toward 900 rebels. The French thought it would be a mop-up operation. They were walking into a meat grinder. The Black Napoleon had set the trap, and the White Napoleon's army was marching right into it. March 1802. The Battle of Crête-à-Pierrot. If you look at a map of the Haitian Revolution, this battle is just a dot. But in the soul of the conflict, it was a supernova. The fort itself was nothing impressive to look at. A small rectangular redoubt made of brick and stone, perched on a hill overlooking the Artibonite River. It was commanded by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the man Toussaint called the Tiger, along with a garrison of roughly 900 soldiers. They were the elite of the Black Army, the hard diehards who had sworn an oath to live free or die. Inside the walls, alongside the men, was Marie-Jeanne Lamartinière, a woman of striking beauty and terrifying courage, who wore a male uniform, a sword at her belt, and walked the ramparts distributing ammunition and morale, proving that the fire of liberty burned in every heart, regardless of gender. Surrounding them, tightening like a constrictor snake, was the French army. General Leclerc had concentrated his forces, 12,000 soldiers, the best infantry divisions France possessed. They brought heavy siege artillery, mortars, and the supreme confidence of men who had conquered Italy and Egypt. They looked up at the little fort and saw a nuisance. They saw a quick morning's work. They did not see a tomb. Before the first shot was fired, Dessalines gathered his men. He stood next to the powder magazine, a lit torch in his hand. He told them that there was no retreat. There was no surrender. If the French breached the walls, he promised to drop the torch into the powder and blow them all, defenders and attackers alike, into eternity. "We are going to be attacked," he roared. "If I die, avenge me. If you see me retreat, kill me. If you see the enemy retreat, kill them." It was the logic of total war. The French attack began with a bombardment that shook the mountains. Iron rain fell on the fort, smashing the masonry, churning the earth. And then the infantry advanced. The French generals, arrogant and impatient, ordered a frontal assault. They sent their columns marching up the hill in perfect formation, drums beating, flags waving. They walked into a slaughterhouse. Dessalines had ordered his men to hold their fire. He waited. The French got closer. 200 yards, 100 yards, 50 yards. They were close enough to see the whites of their eyes, close enough to see the sweat on their faces. And then the order was given. The walls of Crête-à-Pierrot erupted. A sheet of lead tore into the French ranks. The first wave simply evaporated. The French, stunned, wavered, but their discipline held. They stepped over the bodies of their comrades and kept coming. But then, something happened that broke the French spirit more than the bullets. From behind the walls of the fort, above the roar of the cannons, came the sound of singing. The black rebels were singing, and they weren't singing voodoo chants. They were singing La Marseillaise. They were singing Allons enfants de la patrie, contre nous de la tyrannie. Let us go, children of the fatherland. Against us, tyranny stands. The French soldiers froze. They were the soldiers of the Republic. They were supposed to be the children of the fatherland fighting tyranny. But here were former slaves, singing their anthem, fighting for their freedom against an army of invaders. The cognitive dissonance was shattering. French soldiers were heard asking their officers, "Are we the tyrants? Are we the bad guys?" Their morale collapsed. They broke and ran. Leclerc was furious. He ordered attack after attack. For days, he threw his men at the walls. He lost 4 generals. He lost thousands of his best troops. The ditches around the fort were filled so high with French bodies that the living used the dead as sandbags. Inside the fort, the conditions were hellish. Water ran out. Food ran out. The heat was blistering. The smell of rotting corpses was suffocating. But the flag of the rebellion still flew. Toussaint Louverture, watching from the hills, knew that the fort could not hold forever. But that wasn't the point. The point was to bleed the French, to show them the price tag. And the price was too high. After 20 days of siege, with no water left and ammunition critical, Dessalines decided it was time to leave. But he didn't surrender. He didn't wave a white flag. In one of the most daring feats of the war, he waited for a moonless night. He gathered his surviving 600 men, and in total silence, they opened the gates and marched out. They marched straight through the French lines. When they were discovered, they didn't panic. They fixed bayonets and charged. They cut a bloody path through the besieging army, breaking out into the open country and vanishing into the mountains to fight another day. When the French finally entered the fort the next morning, they found it empty. There were only the dead, a few spiked cannons, and the echo of their own humiliation. They had taken the hill, but they had lost the battle. Leclerc wrote to Napoleon, "The rebels fight with a fanaticism that is impossible to describe. These men cheerfully go to their deaths." But despite the moral victory, the strategic situation for Toussaint was grim. The war of attrition was working both ways. His army was shrinking. His generals were tired. The French, despite their losses, kept coming. They controlled the ports and the cities. And Toussaint knew that the rainy season was coming. The yellow fever would soon return to wipe out the French, but he needed to survive until then. He needed a pause. He needed to stop the fighting to save what was left of his army and his people. Toussaint, the master chess player, decided to offer a draw. He opened secret negotiations with Leclerc. He offered to lay down his arms. He offered to retire from public life. But he had conditions. The French had to promise, on their honor, that slavery would never be restored. They had to promise that the black officers would keep their ranks in the French army. Leclerc, desperate to end the fighting before the fever season wiped him out completely, agreed. He lied, of course. His secret orders from Napoleon were still to capture and deport the black leaders, but he needed Toussaint to stop shooting. On May 6, 1802, Toussaint Louverture rode into the French camp at Le Cap to surrender. It was a scene of immense dignity. He was greeted not as a defeated rebel, but as a hero. The French soldiers saluted him. The black population cheered him, weeping. He told Leclerc, "I accept everything which is favorable for the people and for the army. For myself, I wish to live in retirement." It seemed the war was over. Toussaint retired to his plantation in Ennery. He took off his general's uniform and put on the clothes of a farmer. He sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the mountains he had conquered. He was waiting. He knew the French. He knew Napoleon. He knew this peace was a lie. But he also knew something else. The seeds he had planted were deep. Leclerc was terrified of the old man on the porch. Even in retirement, Toussaint was the center of gravity for the island. As long as he breathed, the French could never truly be masters. Leclerc wrote to Napoleon, "He must be removed. He is the soul of the rebellion." And so, the trap was set. In June 1802, just a month after the surrender, French General Brunet sent a friendly letter to Toussaint. He invited him to a meeting to discuss logistics and the welfare of the black troops. It was a cordial, polite invitation between officers. Toussaint's friends warned him. "Do not go," they said. "It is a trap." But Toussaint went. Why? Historians have argued about this for 2 centuries. Was he arrogant? Did he believe that his status as a French general protected him? Or was it a final act of martyrdom? Did he know he would be taken? And did he realize that his arrest would be the spark that would ignite the final victorious phase of the war? He arrived at Brunet's headquarters. He was welcomed warmly. He was led into a parlor. And then the doors were locked. French grenadiers burst into the room with bayonets drawn. Toussaint did not fight. He stood up, straightened his coat, and looked at them with the contempt of a king looking at thieves. They dragged him out the back door. They threw him into a carriage. They rushed him to the coast under the cover of darkness and put him on a warship bound for France. He was not allowed to say goodbye to his wife or his children. He was stripped of his rank, his dignity, and his home. As he stepped onto the deck of the ship, Toussaint Louverture turned to the French captain and spoke the words that would become his epitaph and his curse upon the French Empire. He did not plead for his life. He delivered a prophecy. "In overthrowing me," he said, his voice calm and level, "you have cut down in Saint-Domingue only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again from the roots, for they are numerous and they are deep." The ship sailed. Toussaint looked back at the mountains of Haiti for the last time. He was leaving the world he had made. He was heading into the cold embrace of the old world. Napoleon had his prize. The Black Napoleon was in chains. The emperor thought he had won. He thought that by cutting off the head, the body would die. He was wrong. He had forgotten about the roots. And he had forgotten about the tiger. Jean-Jacques Dessalines was still on the island. And he was watching. The war for autonomy was over. The war for annihilation was about to begin. Toussaint was the sacrifice. But the altar was already being prepared for the French army. August 1802. The fortress of Joux sits atop a sheer cliff in the Jura Mountains of eastern France, near the Swiss border. It is a cold, forbidding place of gray stone and icy winds, a prison designed to break the bodies and minds of the state's enemies. Deep inside its bowels, in a cell where water dripped constantly from the walls and the temperature hovered near freezing, sat the man who had once ruled a tropical kingdom. Toussaint Louverture, the governor-general for life, the Black Napoleon, was now prisoner number 1. Napoleon Bonaparte had given specific instructions for his treatment. Toussaint was to be stripped of his uniform, his rank, and his dignity. He was given the rough clothes of a convict. His wood stove was removed. His food was rationed to the bare minimum needed to keep him alive, but always hungry. He was denied visitors, denied news of his family, denied even a doctor as his health began to fail. It was a slow, calculated execution by neglect. Napoleon did not want to make him a martyr by firing squad. He wanted him to be erased. He wanted the cold to do what the French army could not. In his solitude, Toussaint wrote letters. He wrote to the first consul, pleading for a trial, appealing to Napoleon's sense of honor. "General," he wrote, "I have been made the victim of my own loyalty. I have served my country with fidelity." But Napoleon never answered. To the Emperor of the French, Toussaint was not a rival general. He was a rebellious property that had been reacquired and put in storage. Napoleon sent his aide, Caffarelli, to interrogate Toussaint, but not about politics or philosophy. He only asked one question: where is the treasure buried? He believed that Toussaint must have hidden millions in gold in the mountains of Haiti. Toussaint looked at the aide with weary eyes and tapped his chest. "The only riches I possess," he said, "are the treasures of my soul." While Toussaint shivered in the dark, staring at the stone walls, the prophecy he had uttered on the ship was coming true across the ocean. The roots were growing. In Saint-Domingue, the peace was a fragile lie. General Leclerc was the nominal master of the island, but he was losing his army to the invisible assassin of yellow fever. The French soldiers were dying at a rate of 100 a day. The hospitals were overflowing charnel houses, and as the French weakened, their brutality increased. Leclerc, terrified of a new uprising, began to disarm the black population. It was a violent, chaotic process that convinced every black man and woman that slavery was returning. And then, the news arrived that shattered the truce forever. In the neighboring colony of Guadeloupe, the French expeditionary force had done exactly what Toussaint predicted. They had restored slavery. They had crushed the local resistance, killed the black leaders, and put the chains back on the population. The news hit Saint-Domingue like a lightning bolt. The mask was off. The black generals who had surrendered, Dessalines, Christophe, Pétion, looked at each other and realized that Toussaint had been right all along. There was no middle ground. There was no French citizen of African descent. There was only master and slave, and they had to decide, right then and there, which one they were going to be. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the tiger, made the decision for them. He was done with diplomacy. He was done with the French Republic. He met with Alexandre Pétion, the leader of the mixed-race forces, at the town of Arcahé in May 1803. It was a meeting of historic destiny. For a decade, blacks and mulattoes had fought each other, fueled by the divide-and-conquer tactics of the whites. Dessalines and Pétion stood before their troops. Dessalines took a French tricolor flag, the blue, white, and red. With a violent symbolic gesture, he ripped the white strip out of the center of the flag. He threw the white cloth to the ground and trampled it. He then tied the blue and the red together. It was the birth of the Haitian flag. The symbolism was clear and terrifying. The white was gone. Only the black and the mulatto remained, united in blood and war. The slogan was no longer liberty, equality, fraternity. It was liberté ou la mort, liberty or death. And for the first time, they added a new phrase, one that signaled the total nature of the coming war. Coupe tête, boule caille. Cut heads, burn houses. The war that followed was the War of Annihilation. It was one of the most vicious conflicts in human history. Dessalines did not fight to conquer. He fought to cleanse. He ordered the total destruction of the French presence on the island. "The French are not our brothers," he proclaimed. "Their name is horror. Their skin is the color of guilt." Leclerc died of yellow fever in November 1802, screaming in his delirium as the black vomit consumed him. He was replaced by General Donatien de Rochambeau, a man who makes the villains of fiction look tame. Rochambeau was a sadist. He did not just want to defeat the rebels. He wanted to terrorize them into submission. Rochambeau imported thousands of man-hunting dogs from Cuba. He staged public spectacles in the amphitheater of Le Cap, where these dogs were starved and then unleashed on black prisoners, while French officers and their wives watched from the stands, sipping wine. He invented a precursor to the gas chamber. He would pack black prisoners into the holds of ships, burn sulfur throughout the night to suffocate them, and then dump the bodies into the sea in the morning. He drowned so many people in the Bay of Le Cap that the fish were said to have grown fat on human flesh, and the locals refused to eat seafood. But Rochambeau's cruelty backfired. Instead of terrifying the rebels, it clarified the stakes. The black population realized that surrender meant extermination. They fought with the fury of the damned. Women fought alongside men. Children carried ammunition. When the French burned a rebel soldier alive, the rebels would capture a French officer and crucify him on the gates of his own plantation. It was a descent into absolute savagery, a race war where mercy was a forgotten language. Back in the freezing cell in France, Toussaint Louverture's body finally gave out. On April 7, 1803, alone, shivering, and coughing up blood, the father of Haiti died. He was found by a guard, slumped in his chair near the cold fireplace. He was buried in an unmarked grave under the floor of the prison chapel. Napoleon barely acknowledged the news. He thought the problem was solved, but Toussaint's spirit had crossed the ocean. If Toussaint was the mind of the revolution, Dessalines was now its sword, and the sword was swinging. Throughout 1803, the indigenous army, as they now called themselves, pushed the French back. They were no longer a ragtag band. They were a hardened, veteran force that had been fighting for 12 years. They knew every inch of the terrain. They were immune to the fever that was killing the French by the thousands. They cut off the supply lines. They besieged the cities. Rochambeau found Rochambeau was trapped. By November 1803, the French army, once the terror of Europe, was reduced to a starving, disease-ridden remnant, huddled behind the walls of Le Cap. They had eaten their horses, They had eaten the dogs they brought to hunt men. Now they were looking at the sea, praying for sails that would never come. Outside the gates, the indigenous army gathered for the final kill. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the man who had been a field slave, now commanded the destiny of an empire. He looked up at the French defenses and decided that he would not starve them out. He would storm them. He would break the French army in open battle, so the world would know that black men had not just survived, they had conquered. On November 18, 1803, the Battle of Vertières began. It was the Armageddon of the Caribbean. The French held the high ground, fortified in blockhouses with heavy artillery. The Haitian rebels had to charge uphill, across open ground, into the teeth of grapeshot and musket fire. What followed was a display of heroism that borders on the mythological. Leading one of the Haitian columns was a general named François Capua, known to his men as Capua la Mort, Capua Death. As he charged the French lines, a cannonball tore the horse out from under him. Capua scrambled to his feet, drew his sword, and screamed, "Forward! Forward!" A second later, a bullet shot the hat off his head. Capua didn't flinch. He kept running, kept screaming, leading his men into the fire. The French soldiers on the ramparts were so stunned by this display of suicidal bravery that they stopped shooting. For a brief, surreal moment, the battle paused, and the French troops shouted, "Bravo! Bravo!" in admiration of their enemy. And then the slaughter resumed. But the French spirit was broken. They could kill Capua's horse, but they couldn't kill the revolution. The Haitian wave crashed over the French defenses. Rochambeau, the sadist who had drowned thousands, was forced to surrender to the very people he had treated as animals. He begged for 10 days to evacuate. Dessalines gave him 10 days. As the ragged French survivors boarded their ships and sailed away, they left behind more than just a colony. They left behind the myth of white supremacy. It had been drowned in the harbor of Le Cap. On January 1st, 1804, in the city of Gonaïves, Jean-Jacques Dessalines stood before a cheering multitude of victorious generals and soldiers. He read the Act of Independence, but he did not call the new nation Saint-Domingue. That was a French name, a slave name. He reached back into the mist of time, to the language of the Taino people who had lived there before Columbus, before the genocide, before the chains. He renamed the land Haiti, Haiti, land of mountains. It was a rejection of Europe. It was a reclamation of the soil. And in the constitution of this new nation, Dessalines wrote a clause that exploded the racial hierarchy of the world. He declared that from this day forward, every citizen of Haiti, regardless of their actual skin color, would be legally defined as black. He took the badge of shame and turned it into the badge of citizenship. He declared, "I have avenged America." The impact of this victory was a geopolitical earthquake that reshaped the modern world, specifically the United States. Across the ocean, Napoleon Bonaparte looked at the reports from Haiti. He had lost 50,000 of his best troops. He had lost his best generals. He had lost the Pearl of the Antilles. His dream of a French empire in the Americas was dead, buried in the fever-choked cemeteries of Port-au-Prince. Napoleon realized that without the sugar wealth of Haiti, the massive territory of Louisiana, which stretched from New Orleans to Montana, was useless to him. He couldn't defend it, and he couldn't profit from it. So, in a fit of disgust, he decided to sell it. He offered the entire territory to the United States for pennies on the acre. Thomas Jefferson, the American president who was terrified of the Haitian Revolution, jumped at the deal. This is the irony that American history books rarely teach. The Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States and set it on the path to becoming a superpower, was a direct result of the Haitian Revolution. Toussaint Louverture and his army of former slaves did not just free themselves. They effectively gave the United States the western half of its continent. The black freedom fighters of the Caribbean were the invisible architects of the American West. But the world did not thank Haiti. It punished it. The existence of a free black republic was a terrifying anomaly to the powers of the 19th century. The United States, France, Spain, and Britain looked at Haiti and saw a cancer that could spread to their own slaves. They placed a cordon sanitaire around the island, a diplomatic and economic quarantine. Thomas Jefferson refused to recognize the new nation, imposing a crushing embargo. And then came the final, cruelest blow. In 1825, French warships returned to Haiti. They did not come to invade. They came to extort. They demanded that Haiti pay reparations to the French slave owners for the loss of their property, meaning the loss of the human beings who had freed themselves. The sum was staggering: 150 million gold francs. It was a ransom for their existence. Threatened with another war, the Haitian government agreed. For the next 122 years, until 1947, Haiti struggled under the crushing weight of this debt. The wealth that should have built schools, roads, and hospitals was siphoned off to French banks to pay for the crime of freedom. This independence debt is the root cause of much of the poverty that plagues Haiti to this day. The world robbed the cradle of liberty to ensure that the child would never grow strong. But they could not kill the memory. Toussaint Louverture lies in a cold grave in France, far from the tropical sun. But his legacy is not in the ground. It is in the air. He was the first. He was the proof. Before Toussaint, the idea that enslaved people could organize, fight, and defeat a European empire was a fantasy. After Toussaint, it was a fact. He taught the world that the human desire for freedom is stronger than any army, any navy, any chain. He showed that a man born as property could possess a mind greater than a king's. He proved that the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality were not just for white men in Paris parlors. They were for the field hand in the cane, the maroons in the mountains, and the coal-black generals who dared to look an emperor in the eye. Every slave revolt that followed, in America, in Jamaica, in Brazil, looked to Haiti as their North Star. When Denmark Vesey plotted his rebellion in South Carolina, he planned to sail to Haiti. When the Union Army finally allowed black soldiers to fight in the American Civil War, they marched to the spirit of Toussaint. He was the grandfather of global black liberation. His story challenges us today. It challenges us to look at the impoverished nation of Haiti, not with pity, but with awe. The poverty of Haiti is not a sign of failure. It is the scar of a punishment inflicted by a world that could not forgive its freedom. The people of Haiti paid the highest price for liberty that anyone has ever paid, and they paid it for all of us. They said they were beasts. Toussaint made them soldiers. They said they were property. Toussaint made them citizens. They said the island was a prison. Toussaint made it a kingdom. The Black Napoleon did not die in that cell in the Jura Mountains. He dissolved into history, becoming a permanent part of the atmosphere of freedom. Whenever a people rise up against impossible odds, whenever the weak stand up to the strong, whenever a chain is broken by the hand of the oppressed, Toussaint Louverture is there. He was the opening, and the door he kicked down can never be closed again. The roots are deep, and they are everywhere.